As soon as it drops below 73 degrees, I crave soup. And butternut squash is one of my favorites. Oh, my mouth watered just saying that. Of all the different ways to make it, I tested 2. So today I'm gonna show you how to make the best butternut squash soup to make your cold days cozy, warm, and delicious. Let's get started. First, fully wash and dry your butternut squash. It's very important to work on a dry surface with a dry butternut squash so it won't slip off your hands. The safest way to cut it is using a very sharp knife, gripping onto it well, and making sure that the surface is dry so nothing slips. Now that the ends are cut, we've got 2 flat surfaces. Using the biggest part of the butternut squash as the base, we're gonna cut it in half. Carefully slice through it from top to bottom. If needed, use the palm of your hand on the top of the knife to balance yourself and continue to push down. Next, once it's sliced in half, time to scoop out the seeds and the membrane. I find it to be much easier to do it with the ice cream scooper since the edges are sharp and it's easy to hold. Something very interesting about butternut squash is that botanically it's a fruit. However, in culinary arts, it's used as a vegetable that can be roasted, sautéed, toasted, pureed for soups, or mashed in casseroles, breads, muffins, and pies. So many wonderful things you can do. Then you can take the peel off. There's different peelers and different ways, so just try to see which one works best for you, as every one of these butternut squashes is shaped differently. Because of the curves, it's important to always have it laying flat on one of the ends of the surfaces or on the half surface so it's always flat and steady while you peel. Now we're gonna turn it into cubes, so start by cutting it in half and keep going until you have small cubes. Now in a large soup pot, heat it to medium heat. Once it's hot, add some olive oil, then we'll add the butternut squash cubes. Add a little bit of salt. Because salt brings the moisture out of everything, it helps them to cook brown and better and faster to get a nicer, deeper cook for the veggies. Now we're going to chop a shallot. Shallots have more of a mild, somewhat sweet flavor, which is more subtle than the sharp flavor of an onion. But this one's gonna be roasted, so it's gonna soften the flavor. Let's start with the shallot. Now time to add some spices. About a teaspoon of sage, a teaspoon of rosemary, a teaspoon of ground ginger, and a teaspoon of nutmeg. That's approximate since I never measure the spices. And mix it well to incorporate all the ingredients. Because it has salt in here, the veggies are sweating, which helps the spices to not burn. Now add the chopped shallot and freshly chopped garlic. I love garlic and always end up adding way more than the recipes call for, but in this case with this recipe, I recommend not adding too much, no more than what you see here, because it will overpower the flavor of the butternut squash. And mix it really well. After a few minutes, it will be fragrant. That's when it's time to add the broth. The key thing with the broth is it needs to be either hot or warm before adding it so you don't bring down the temperature of the pot or the vegetables. Mix everything really well, and because broth was added that's unsalted, it will change the flavor, so taste it and then adjust. Bring to a boil and then turn the heat down to a simmer and cover and let it simmer for a few minutes. Now that everything is ready, transfer the ingredients into a blender. Blend everything really well. If it doesn't fit, do not go over the top on the blender as it will explode. So do it in batches to be safe. Mine fit, so I blended it all together. And then to take the flavor up a notch a little bit more, I'm adding maple syrup. Right at the end, I always like to add a cube of butter when blending creamy soups in the final step, as it emulsifies the soup and leaves it creamy and rich with a lovely flavor. Now let's take this soup up a notch. More like a huge leap, because this second way is my favorite in terms of flavor and process. And it's so easy. Preheat your oven to 430 degrees Fahrenheit. Before roasting it, we're gonna prep the butternut squash just like we did the previous one by cutting the ends and cutting it in half, just like I showed you earlier. This time around, I used a spoon to take the membranes and the seeds off, and I'm telling you, the ice cream scooper worked better. But if you want to use a spoon, it works too. See, look at that, it looks beautiful anyway. Make sure not to cut this one in cubes, we're going to roast it. Place parchment paper in a clean baking sheet and place them on your baking sheet with the parchment paper underneath to make sure they don't stick, and sprinkle with avocado oil. It's important not to use olive oil because avocado oil is for high heat. Add some salt and fresh ground pepper. All of the ingredients will be roasted, however, this takes the longest, so the butternut squash is going to go into the oven first. The butternut squash will stay in the oven for 30 minutes. Then cut a yellow onion in half and a head of garlic in half and add avocado oil to both ends, and you'll place it in the cooking sheet with the butternut squash to leave everything back in there for 30 minutes. Just be sure to flip the butternut squash over to roast the other side. Once they're roasted, take them out of the oven and look at that. It's beautifully caramelized. Now the garlic caramelized, the onions caramelized, and the butternut squash, all of it is caramelized and roasted. Now the flavor will really be amazing. Allow it to cool enough just to the touch so that it's still as hot as it can be taken without burning yourself. What we want is to take out the inside of the butternut squash to put it into the blender, hopefully when it's still hot. Then peel the onion and remove the ends with a knife. I quarter the onions even though they're soft, just so I can fit everything much better in the blender. And you can just squeeze the garlic out. Once it's roasted, it's soft, it smells delicious, and it's really easy to take out. Now add all your roasted veggies to the blender. In this case, the butternut squash was bigger, so I'm gonna have to do this in batches. Next, add broth. It can be veggie broth, chicken broth, bone broth, whatever broth you prefer. Then add maple syrup, nutmeg, sage, ground ginger, and rosemary. And blend it really well. With my blender, I like to start on low, work my way up to higher and higher until I go to the highest point. And then as you see it getting thicker, add more bone broth or veggie broth or whichever broth you want to use to thin it out. Once you fully blend everything and have the consistency you like, then at the end, I like to use butter to make it creamier and emulsify it. And taste it and adjust it to your liking. I like adding bouillon because the broth that I use doesn't have really much flavor, but you don't have to do that step. Now that it tastes amazing, it's easy to just plate it straight from the blender if you'd like. Or you can run it through a strainer to get a silkier soup. And lastly, we eat with our eyes, so to garnish it, you can have maybe some grated fresh ginger, parsley, pumpkin seeds, and some fresh ground pepper. Now my favorite part, tasting them. First one I'm gonna try is the one made on the stovetop. I can't even talk. Okay, so the roasted version. Okay, so I think the roasted version has much more depth and complexity to the flavor, and surprisingly, it doesn't take much longer to make, really. So I think the truth is that it takes about the same amount to make and the same effort to do the roasted than the stovetop. So if you like the flavor of roasted veggies, you can apply the same process to other soup recipes to make them even more flavorful.